Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to East Central Missouri and the world, and welcome to the James Strong Show podcast number 289. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for making us a part of your day. I appreciate it. This podcast was recorded on the morning of Saturday, October the 22nd, from the James Strong Studio in Western St. Charles County. Topic of today's podcast. Haven't done one of these in just a little bit, but it's about one of the old rock and rollers, and we're going to entitle it "The Chuck Berry You Never Knew." Everybody knows about Chuck Berry and the Duck Walk and the Johnny Be Good, et cetera, et cetera. But there's a whole lot more to Chuck Berry that folks may or may not be aware of. The father of rock and roll, sure, but he had to say he had a sketchy past is being kind, okay? Some of it had to do with the racism of the times. Some of it had to do with the fact that Barry just did his own thing and really didn't care about what other people thought. And quite often, those things were just against the law. Anyway, the Chuck Berry You Never Knew, the essay for today's podcast. But before we start out, I wanted to talk about a few things that are not necessarily in the news, but just food for thought. We'll say that. Last week's podcast, I got a lot of feedback about last week's podcast and kind of the whole glass half full and basically the topic of overlooked opportunities in the United States and the Western world as a whole. The Western world, the United States in particular, I think gets a bad rap because there's a lot of people who live in these places who say, things aren't good, they're awful, they're this, and anybody who doesn't live here laughs at that, okay? Case in point, I'm going to talk about a guy who you've never heard of. A handful of you may have. You're familiar with what he does, but you've never heard of this guy. His name is Sundar Pichai, and I may be pronouncing his last name incorrectly. Sundar Pichai. He was born in India to a well-to-do family, okay? He's a Hindu. Sorry about that. He's a Hindu, and he was born into the Brahma class, that's the elite, okay? Well-to-do family. His dad was a overperformer. He worked a full-time job as an electrical engineer. Oh, yeah, and on the side, had a manufacturing firm that produced electronic components. So the guy had money. He had privilege in a third world country. But he could have stuck around there. He could have done his own thing, and he could have just lived a very happy, comfortable life in India. But he didn't. Graduated from university in India, got a materials degree, but thought, you know what, there's more to it. And there's more to life than just being here in India. So what did he do? He came to the United States, okay? Went to Stanford University, got another degree there. And he changed his name. And actually, we know him as Sundar Pichai, but his real name, and in South India, this guy's of Tamil descent. In South India, people tend to go by one name, their initial and then one name. And his name was, let's see if I can pronounce this, Sundararajan, okay? P. Sundararajan is what his name was. And the first thing he did is he says, okay, first of all, if I'm going to come to the United States, I have to have two names. And Sundararajan is not something that people in the West are going to be able to pronounce. So he just decided to call himself Sundar Pichai. Not sure where he got that name. I think it had to do with, part of it was his dad's name. Part of it was just he kind of made smaller the Sundararajan part of his name. And so changed his name. Okay, so he moved across the globe, changed his name. Oh, and what did he do then? Oh, by the way, he's the CEO of Alphabet. That's Google. At age 50, he's worth $1.3 billion. Okay. Now, here's a guy who had a good, comfortable life near his family in India. So he moves across the country, across the world, I should say, picks up a language that was not his first language, went to school, got more schooling, changed his name so that the people in that part of the world could pronounce it better, and runs arguably the most successful company in the world. And he's worth $1.3 billion. And all that started because he decided to get out of his comfort zone and move to the United States of America. Now, to those friends of mine in India who are listening on the GeoSavan app, I apologize for butchering this gentleman's name. I'm sure I'm not pronouncing it 100% correctly, so please pardon me for that. But this is just to show that if you're in this country and saying the opportunity is gone, no offense, but you're a fool. Got one for the children here. And Halloween is close by. And if the children would like to have a joke that the old people who give them candy will enjoy, here's a joke. What do you get when you divide the circumference of a pumpkin by its diameter? The answer? Pumpkin pie. The kids may not understand that, but trust me, the adults will think it's hilarious. And kids, you'll get more candy. So take the strong man's advice on this one. Okay, before we get to the essay on the Chuck Berry You Never Knew, there is one story in the news that, and this is just not the local news, this is the world news, okay? It's made world news, and it's really been on, we've been talking about this, I'll just say all my life, okay? And we're still talking about it, and we're still surprisingly doing very little about it. And it has to do with Jana Elementary School in the Hazelwood School District. Ferguson Florissant School District, it's one of the two, I forget. Anyway, a recent report pointed out that radioactive contamination of St. Louis County School, Jana Elementary, was a big deal. Now, where did this contamination come from? Now, while it may be difficult to pinpoint the exact source, we kind of know. In fact, radioactive waste has inhabited St. Louis County region for decades. Decades, friends. Where did it come from? Well, in the 1940s, St. Louis had a site dedicated to the Manhattan Project. Yeah, that Manhattan Project, the atomic bomb. That was the code name for the American-led effort to develop a functional atomic weapon during World War II. The project started in response to German scientists who had been working on the nuclear weapons technology since the 30s. Of course, we took some of those German scientists after the war was ended, and we brought them to this country by way of Operation Paperclip and Werner von Braun, all those guys, and that's another story for another day. But the Mallinckrodt Chemical Works factory, located near the Mississippi River in downtown St. Louis, was built to process uranium. According to the company's timeline, the Mallinckrodt Chemical Company filtered and created all the uranium oxide used by the Manhattan Project in 1942. The chemical waste the plant created was stored at a site in north of St. Louis Lambert Airport. The waste sat there from 1947 into the 60s, almost 20 years, just uncovered. In the 60s, the land was purchased and the waste was moved to a new site on Laddie Avenue in North St. Louis County, down the street from where I lived for 8 years, by the way. Environmental specialists say the radioactive waste was not stored correctly at either site. Coldwater Creek, which runs north from Overland to Spanish Lake, picked up contamination over a period of several years when piles of radioactive waste were left along Laddie Avenue and entered the creek during heavy rains and floods. Now, in 1973, around 47,000 tons of the same radioactive waste was illegally dumped in the Westlake landfill in Bridgeton. Does that name sound familiar? Yeah, it's been on fire for years. So yeah, they took 47,000 tons of that waste, illegally dumped it in a landfill, and it's now burning, okay? If you drive down Highway 70, when you hit Earth City and you smell something awful, part of that is the stinking radioactive waste burning in the Westlake landfill. Yeah, That's right. Now, the EPA did deem that creek and landfill as Superfund sites in 1989, but they're kind of working on it. They're kind of not. So in 1989, what is that? Let's do the quick math. That was 33 years ago. They said, yep, this is a Superfund site that we have to do something about. And they still haven't. Now, Coldwater Creek carried this radioactive material into North St. Louis County, contaminating much of the area around the creek. Concerns about newly discovered radioactive contamination at Jana Elementary increased after Coldwater Creek flooded in July amid record-breaking rainfall in the St. Louis region. That's when we had 10 inches of rain in a 24-hour period, okay? Now, residents around some communities near Coldwater Creek have seen increased rates of rare cancers, birth defects, and various autoimmune disorders that are potentially linked to ionizing radiation poisoning. Now, here's a question I have for you. Again, they don't know for sure where that waste came from. But for some reason, after the creek flooded, they thought, you know what, we need to test Jana Elementary School. I don't know why they decided to do that, but they did. And they found out there was radioactive waste there. Now, here's my question. Why aren't they testing other schools, other homes, other businesses around Coldwater Creek that flooded? They tested the school, but they haven't tested other areas. I think I have the answer. The answer probably is they don't want to turn half of North St. Louis County into a Superfund site. And even if they decided to test it, and even if they found that that whole area in the Coldwater Creek floodplain is radioactive, which, by the way, Coldwater Creek runs into the Mississippi River and then all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico. But that's another story for another day. But let's say they did decide to test everything in that watershed. And let's say they did find out, you know what? Wow, there's radioactivity everywhere. And they decided to create a Superfund site. Remember, Westlake Landfill has been deemed a Superfund site now for 33 years, and they've done next to nothing. It's just amazing how this stuff works, okay? I'm not saying that there was criminal intent when all this was done, because we really didn't know much about radioactivity, and back then, maybe just move the stuff out by the airport when nobody lives, but then people started living there, etc. But why don't they do something about it now? It's hard to say. Actually, maybe it's not so hard to say. Maybe it's easy to say. And we just don't want to spend the money, take the time, take the effort to fix it right. Okay, the topic of today's essay, the Chuck Berry You Never Knew. His name, Chuck Edward Anderson Berry, born in 1926, died in 2017. He was 90 years old. He was an American singer, songwriter, and guitarist who pioneered rock and roll. He's been called the father of rock and roll, rightfully so, in my opinion. And he refined, developed, and made popular rhythm and blues into major elements that made rock and roll distinctive with songs like Maybelline, Roll Over Beethoven, Rock and Roll Music, and Johnny Be Good. Now, he wrote lyrics that focused on team life, consumerism, and he developed a musical style that included guitar solos and showmanship. Berry was a major influence on rock music, and that's being kind. He was born in St. Louis. He grew up in a North St. Louis neighborhood known as the Ville. This was an area where many middle-class people lived. His father, Henry William Berry, was a contractor and a deacon at the nearby Baptist church. His mother, Martha Bell, was a certified public school principal. So he wasn't born into poverty. Berry's upbringing allowed him to pursue his interests in music at an early age. He gave his first public performance in 1941 while still a student at Sumner High School. And that's where things started to go south, still in high school. He was still a student there in 1944 as well, when he was arrested for armed robbery after robbing 3 shops in Kansas City, Missouri, and then stealing a car at gunpoint with some friends. Berry's account in his autobiography is that His car broke down. He flagged down a passenger car and stole it at gunpoint with a non-functional pistol. He was convicted and sent to the reformatory for young men at Algoa near Jefferson City, Missouri, where he formed a singing quartet and did some boxing. The singing group became competent enough, the authorities allowed it to perform outside the detention facility. Berry was released from the reformatory on his 21st birthday in 1947. The next year in 48, he married Thelma Taggy Suggs and remained married to her for the remainder of his life. Their life, I should say. Berry supported his family by taking various jobs in St. Louis, working briefly as a factory worker at 2 automobile assembly plants and a janitor in the apartment building where he and his wife lived. He also went to train as a beautician at the Poro College of Cosmetology, ran by Annie Malone. Yeah, that Annie Malone. He was doing well enough by 1950 to buy a small 3-room brick cottage with a bathroom on Whittier Street. In fact, that house is now known as the Chuck Berry House, and it's on the National Register of Historic Places. In the early 1950s, Berry was working with local bands and clubs in St. Louis as an extra source of income. He'd been playing blues since his teens, and he borrowed guitar riffs and showmanship techniques from blues musician T-Bone Walker. He also took guitar lessons from his friend Ira Harris, which laid the foundation for his guitar style. By early 1953, Berry was performing with Johnny Johnson's trio, starting a long-time collaboration with the pianist. The band played blues and ballads as well as country. Berry wrote, in his autobiography, "Curiosity provoked me to lay out a lot of country stuff with our predominantly black audience. And some of our black audience began whispering, 'Who's that black hillbilly?' After they laughed at me a few times, they began requesting the hillbilly stuff, and they enjoyed dancing to it." Berry's showmanship, along with a mix of country tunes and R&B tunes, sung in the style of Nat King Cole, set to the music of Muddy Waters, brought a wider audience. In particular, and this is important, affluent white people. Now, why is that important? Because they had the money. Now, in May of 1955, Berry traveled to Chicago, where he met Muddy Waters, who suggested he contact Leonard Chess of Chess Records. Berry thought his blues music would interest Chess, but Chess was a larger fan of Berry's take on Ida Red. Now, in May 1955, Berry recorded an adaptation of that song, Ida Red, but retitled it and called it Maybelline, with Johnny Johnson on piano, Jerome Green from Bo Diddley's band on the maracas, Ebby Hardy on drums, and Willie Dixon on the bass. Maybelline sold over 1 million copies, reaching number 1 on Billboard magazine's Rhythm and Blues chart and number 5 on the Best Seller in Stores chart for September 10th, 1955. Berry again said in his autobiography, "It came out at the right time when African-American music was spilling over into mainstream pop." So even Berry admitted that timing was right for his music to become popular. Now, when Berry saw a copy of the Maybelline record, he was surprised that 2 other individuals, including DJ Alan Freed, was giving writing credit. That would entitle them to some of the royalties. He took them to court, and Berry won full credit. And that was part of what made Berry skeptical, paranoid, rightfully so maybe, because not just because he was black, but that's how things worked in the music industry. And if you talk to people nowadays, that's how things still work in the music industry, where people try to get a piece of the action without really contributing. But by the end of 1956, his song Roll Over Beethoven reached number 29 on Billboard's Top 100, and Berry toured as one of the top acts of 1956. He and Carl Perkins became friends. In fact, Perkins said, "I knew when I first heard Chuck that he had been affected by country music. I respected his writing. His records were very, very great." Now, in late 1957, Berry took part in Alan Freed's Biggest Show of the Stars in 1957, touring the United States with the Everly Brothers, Buddy Holly, and others. Now, he continued hits in 1957 and 1959, with Berry scoring over a dozen chart singles during this period, including U.S. top 10 hits School Days, Rock and Roll Music, Sweet Little 16, and Johnny Be Good. He appeared in 2 early rock and roll movies, Rock, Rock, Rock in 56, which he sang You Can't Catch Me, and Go, Johnny, Go in 1959, in which he had a speaking role as himself and performed Johnny Be Good, Memphis, Tennessee, and Little Queenie. His performance of Sweet Little 16 at the Newport Jazz Festival in 1958 was captured in the motion picture Jazz on a Summer's Day. The opening guitar riff of Johnny Be Good is surprisingly similar to the one used by Louis Jordan in Ain't That Just Like a Woman. That was from 1946. In fact, Berry acknowledged the debt to Jordan, and several sources have indicated that his work was influenced by Jordan in general. Now, by the late 50s, Berry was a high-profile established star with several hit records and film appearances and a lucrative touring career. He had opened a racially integrated nightclub in St. Louis called Berry's Club Bandstand and invested in real estate. So he was really becoming a mover and shaker. But December 1959, he was arrested under the Mann Act after allegations that he had sexual intercourse with a 14-year-old Apache waitress named Janice Escalante, who had been transported across state lines, actually across federal lines because she was in Mexico, to work as a hat check girl at his club. After a 2-week trial in 1960, he was convicted. He was convicted, and Berry served 1.5 years in prison from February 62 to October 63. Now, here's the thing. Berry was convicted of the Mann Act. But that was not the first time he had charges brought up against him for the Mann Act. The Mann Act is transporting a minor across state lines with the intent to do sexual harm. The intent, okay, not the act necessarily. Now, in 1958, a 17-year-old girl named Joan Bates was also allegedly brought across state lines, and Berry was brought up on charges of the Mann Act. But the judge said, look, we're only going to charge you on this if you do it again. In other words, if you don't do it again, you're good. So a year later, he does it again. He was also arrested for carrying a firearm, a loaded firearm under his seat. And they let that one slide too, which is why they didn't let the whole Mann Act allegations against Janice Escalante slide, because this was not the first time that Berry had done this. And even remember, although he was a juvenile, he served time for armed robbery before too. So maybe this was a 1950s version or 60s version, I guess, of 3 strikes. All right. Now, finally, when Berry was released from prison in 1963, his return to recording and performing was made easier because the British invasion bands, notably the Beatles and the Rolling Stones, had sustained interest in his music by releasing cover versions of his songs. And other bands had reworked them, like the Beach Boys' Surfin' USA, which used the melody of Berry's Sweet Little 16. In 64 and 65, Berry released commercially successful singles reaching top 20 in the Billboard 100, No Particular Place to Go, and a humorous reworking of School Days and You Never Can Tell. So basically, while he was in prison, other people covered his music, so when he came out, his music was already on the forefront. People were used to listening to it. So they were excited that the writer of this music was out of prison, and he became popular again. Okay. Now, between 1966 and 1969, Berry released 5 albums for Mercury Records, including his second live album, Live at the Fillmore Auditorium. And it was backed by the Steve Miller Band. Yeah, that's Steve Miller Band. Now, Berry was still a top concert draw after he got out of prison. And in May 1964, he made a successful tour of the UK. But when he returned from that tour in January 65, his behavior was erratic and moody, and his tour style of using unrehearsed local backing bands and a strict non-negotiable contract was earning him a reputation as a difficult and unexciting performer. part of what Barry used to do was he would go into a venue. He'd say, okay, I'm going to go ahead and play at your club. And the club was excited to have him. And basically, he traveled with a hot plate and his guitar. That was about it. And they said, well, where's your band? He said, well, you need to get a backup band. They said, what do you mean a backup band? He said, everybody knows my music. Just get a backup band and we'll play. And they didn't rehearse. They didn't do any of that, okay? But they still drew a crowd, so they let him have his way. The other thing Barry used to do, two other things that Barry used to do, is he would demand cash in advance for his performance. And he did that because one time he got stiffed. He didn't ask for cash in advance, and the house never paid him. He says that's never going to happen again, so he demanded cash in advance. In fact, up until the day he died, when he would play, he demanded cash in advance. And there had been times where, and he wanted cash in advance, not a check. In fact, one time there was a story about how a promoter at a nightclub gave him a check. He said, no, you got to cash this check. He said, it's 8 o'clock at night. How am I going to get a check? He said, well, you got to figure that out. You got to cash the check and give me cash. The show started like an hour and a half late. They finally got the cash, gave it to him. Barry smiled, said, cool, stuck the cash in his pocket and went out and performed the show. Started an hour and a half late, but he was uncompromising. He would not budge. Now, Barry helped give life to a subculture. In fact, remember the song? His only number one hit, My Ding-a-Ling, okay? A fourth grade wee-wee joke that used to mortify true believers at college concerts permitted a lot of 12-year-olds new insight into the new concept of dirty when it hit the airwaves. And I remember that because when that hit in 1972, I was 14 years old. And at first I thought it was a goof, but then people sang it and teachers didn't like it, but hey, we're just singing a popular song. It's number one song in the country. And it was a lot of innuendo and that, but it was just a goofy, dopey, funny, catchy song. Now, back in between 1970 and 1973, Barry had returned to Chess Records. Now, there were no hit singles from the 70 album Back Home, but in 72, Chess Records released a live version of My Ding-a-Ling, and that's the one that everybody knows, okay? Actually, it's a version of a song called My Tambourine from Barry's 1968 LP, From St. Louis to Frisco. Now, the track became his only number one hit. That's right. Johnny B. Good wasn't number one. Maybelline wasn't number one. But My Ding-a-Ling was his only number one hit. Now, he issued another record called Reelin' and Rockin' the same year. And it was the last top 40 hit in the U.S. and the U.K. After that, he was done. No more top hits. In fact, but in the 1970s, Barry did tour with the strength of his earlier career. Kind of the first guy to do an old rockers tour. Because by the 70s, the guy was in his almost 60 years old, okay? He was on the road for many years carrying only his Gibson guitar, confident that he could hire a band that already knew his music no matter where he went. In fact, the publication AllMusic said that in this period, his live performance became increasingly erratic, working with terrible backup bands and turning in sloppy, out-of-tune performances which tarnished his reputation with younger fans and old-timers alike. Now, among the band leaders performing a backup role with Barry in the 70s, we mentioned Steve Miller and Bruce Springsteen, when each was just starting their career. So, you have this backup band, and hey, you have an opportunity to go and back up Chuck Berry. Why wouldn't you do that? It's good for your career, okay? Now, here's the thing. Springsteen related in the documentary film Hail, Hail, Rock and Roll, that Berry didn't give the band a set list, and he just expected the musicians to follow the lead after each guitar intro. Berry didn't speak to the band after the show. Even so, Springsteen backed Barry again when he appeared in concert at the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 1995. So, picture this. You're a backup band, and somebody approaches you and says, hey, Chuck Berry's going to play at my club. You want to back him up? everybody's going to say yes. You're not given you're not given a set list. In other words, you don't know what song he's going to play and in what order. So Barry just says, look, you all know my music. I'll start off with the guitar. You'll know what the song is and just kind of join in. And they never rehearsed beforehand. In fact, quite often, they never met beforehand. I can only imagine how awful the performances were. But as often as they were, as awful as they were, he still drew a crowd. He still drew a crowd. In fact, in the 70s, when I was in high school, I used to work at Sambo's restaurant right there at the airport. And after a performance, I would work the graveyard shift on the weekends when I was in high school. So I worked from 12 at night until 7 in the morning, washing dishes. And about once a month, Chuck Berry would come in. He would come in after 1 in the morning when the bars closed. I mean, he did his deal, had a drink, came on in, eat steak and eggs, drink coffee, and talk to the folks. I mean, he was Chuck Berry. He chain smoked at the counter, talked to people, and then when he was done, paid his bill and got back into his big black Fleetwood Cadillac and drove home to Ladue or Wentzville or wherever he was living at that time. So he was even bigger than life back then. In fact, I remember seeing Chuck Berry, and I thought to myself, wow, that's Chuck Berry? I mean, his clothes were dirty. He was unkempt. His hair was a mess. He chain smoked cigarettes. He was kind of rude to people, but he was Chuck Berry. And he was the biggest thing that would come into Sambo's restaurant at 1:30 in the morning on a Saturday night. But Berry's touring style, his traveling oldies circuit into the 70s, again, being paid in cash in advance, it added ammunition to the Internal Revenue Service's accusation that Berry had evaded paying income taxes. Yep, once again, he was in trouble with the law. And I think, at least people believe, that part of the reason that Berry wanted cash in advance is because he didn't want to pay taxes. Now, everybody knows, I don't care who you are, if you're Al Capone, if you're the President of the United States, if you're the founder of rock and roll music, Uncle Sugar's going to get his cut, okay? So the Internal Revenue Service said they told Berry, look, I don't think you paid income taxes. They went ahead and audited him. Now facing criminal sanctions for the third time, Berry just pleaded guilty to evading nearly $110,000 in federal income tax owed during 1973. Newspapers reported in 79 put his 1973 joint income with his wife at $374,000 and change. He was sentenced to 4 months in prison and 1,000 hours of community service. Now, Berry continued, after he got out of prison, again, Berry continued to play 70 to 100 one-nighters a year in the 1980s, still traveling solo and still requiring a local band to back him up at each stop. In 1986, Taylor Hackford made a documentary film called Hail, Hail, Rock and Roll, a celebration of Berry's concerts for his 60th birthday, organized by Keith Richards, Eric Clapton, Etta James, Julian Leonard, Robert Clay, and Linda Ronstadt, among others. They appeared with Berry on stage during the film. During the concert, Berry played a Gibson ES-355, the luxury version of his ES-335 that he favored on his 1970 tours. Now, in the late 1980s, Berry bought the Southern Air, an old restaurant in Wentzville, Missouri. More legal problems. Now, in November of 2000, and I remember this because I lived out here then, in November of 2000, Berry faced legal issues when he was sued by his former pianist, Johnny Johnson, who claimed that he had co-written over 50 songs, including No Particular Place to Go, Sweet Little 16, and Roll Over Beethoven, that Berry credited alone. So here's Chuck Berry, who was mad because other people tried to get in on his action. And it appears, at least according to Johnny Johnson, that Berry didn't credit Johnny Johnson. Well, Johnson brought Berry to court, but the case was dismissed when the judge ruled that too much time had passed since the songs had been written. In 2008, Berry toured Europe with stops in Sweden, Norway, Finland, and the UK and Netherlands, Ireland, and Switzerland, and Poland and Spain. In 2008, he played at the Version Festival in Baltimore. Now, during that time, Barry lived in Ladue, Missouri. Those of you around here know Ladue, nice area, approximately 10 miles west of St. Louis proper. He also had a home at Berry Park near Wentzville, where he lived part-time since the 1950s. And actually, that was the home when he lived in when he died. Had a guitar-shaped swimming pool, and he had a guitar-shaped swimming pool and all kinds of other nice stuff at Berry Park. He regularly performed one Wednesday each month at Blueberry Hill, a restaurant and bar located in the Del Mar Loop, from 1996 until 2014. Barry announced on his 90th birthday that his first studio album since Rocket in 1979, entitled Chuck, would be released in 2017, his first record in 38 years. His children, Chuck Berry Jr. and Ingrid, played on the album. He dedicated the song, or the whole album, to his wife of 68 years, Toadie, who put up with a lot of baloney, by the way. Now, Barry's legal problems were far from over. In 1987, he was charged with assaulting a woman in the Gramercy Park Hotel. He was accused of causing lacerations to the mouth, requiring 5 stitches, loose teeth, and contusions of the face. He pled guilty to a lesser charge of harassment and paid the $250 fine. In 1990, he was sued by women who claimed that he had installed a video camera in the bathroom of his restaurant, the Southern Air. I remember this. And Barry claimed that, I put the bathroom in there to catch a worker who he thought was stealing from him. Now, although his guilt was never proven in court, Barry opted for a class action settlement. One of his biographers, Bruce Pegg, estimated that Barry paid over $1.2 million plus that in legal fees. His lawyers said that he had been the victim of a conspiracy to profit from his wealth. Now, reportedly, a police raid on his house found intimate videotapes of women, one of which appeared to be a minor. He also, in the raid, they found 62 grams of marijuana. Federal drug and child abuse charges were filed. The child abuse charges were eventually dropped, and Barry agreed to plead guilty to misdemeanor possession of marijuana. He was given a 6-month suspended jail sentence, placed on 2 years unsupervised probation, and was ordered to donate $5,000 to a local hospital. Later, videos Barry recorded of himself urinating on a woman and another of her defecating on him would surface, and I remember those videos. They were for real. March 2017, Barry was found unresponsive at his home near Wentzville. Emergency workers were called to the scenes, unable to revive him, and he was pronounced dead by his personal physician. His funeral was held in 2017 at the Pageant in St. Louis. He was remembered with a public viewing by his family, friends, and fans at the Pageant, a music club where he often performed. He was viewed with his cherry red Gibson ES-335 guitar bolted to the inside of the coffin lid, and with flower arrangements, including one sent by the Rolling Stones, in the shape of a guitar. There was also a private service held at the club celebrating Barry's life and musical career, with the Barry family inviting 300 members of the public to the service. Gene Simmons of Kiss gave an impromptu, unadvertised eulogy at the service. Now, Little Richard was scheduled to lead the funeral procession, but he was unable to attend because of an illness. One of Barry's attorneys estimated that his estate was worth $50 million, including $17 million in music rights. Barry's music publishing accounted for $13 million of the estate's value. Barry is interred in a mausoleum in Bellerive Garden Cemetery in St. Louis. Now, while no individuals can say to have invented rock and roll, Chuck Berry, in my opinion, comes closest to any figure to being the one who put all the essential pieces together. It was his particular genius to graft country western guitar licks into rhythm and blues, and that was in his first hit, Maybelline, okay? Now, a pioneer of rock and roll, Barry was a significant influence on the development of both the music and the attitude associated with rock and roll music style. Maybelline, Roll Over Beethoven, rock and roll music, Johnny B. Good. Barry refined and developed rhythm and blues into the major elements of rhythm and blues that made rock and roll distinctive, with lyrics successfully aimed to appeal to the early teenage market by using graphic and humorous descriptions of teen dances, fast cars, Hollywood life, and consumer culture. and utilizing guitar solos and showmanship that would be a major influence on subsequent rock music. Now, in addition to the Beatles and the Rolling Stones, a large number of significantly popular rock performers have recorded Barry songs. Now, although not technically accomplished, Barry's guitar style was distinctive, and he incorporated electronic effects to mimic the sound of bottleneck blues guitarists. Barry's showmanship has been influential on other rock guitarists, particularly his one-leg hop routine and his patented duck walk. Now, Barry has been cited as a major influence to a variety of some of the most influential acts of all times. And this alone has to answer the question, was Barry the king of rock and roll? Okay, here are the acts who said Barry was a major influence to their music. That list includes Elvis Presley, Jimi Hendrix, the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, the Beach Boys, Carl Perkins, the Dave Clark Five, Electric Light Orchestra, Status Quo, AC/DC, Bryan Adams, The Faces, David Bowie, the Yardbirds, the Kinks, Buddy Holly. All those groups and people said Barry was a major influence, and they all covered Barry songs or borrowed from his lyrics. Now, was he the greatest of all times? Probably, maybe, okay? And the thing about Chuck Berry, and here's the big controversy about Chuck Berry. Nobody doubts his musical, that he was a pioneer, at the very least, a pioneer of rock and roll music. It's a fact that he was a pioneer. It's an opinion that he was the founder of rock and roll. But here's the big controversy. And there's a statue of him on the Del Mar Loop. And many have criticized that because of his, the guy was a criminal. I mean, besides the tax evasion and the armed robbery, all of which he admitted to, by the way, in his book, Long, Tall, Handsome Man, I believe, Brown, Tall, Handsome Man, I believe is the name of the book I read. He admits to, I stole from the government. I didn't want to pay my taxes. I figured they didn't need the money. Well, you got to pay it, okay? He admitted to that armed robbery as a kid. I mean, he admitted to transporting that gal across state lines, federal lines, Janice Escalante. He admitted to doing that. Yeah, I did it. Now, he did not say he raped her, but you can't take a 14-year-old and take her away from her home, live with her basically for 2 weeks, sleep in the same bed with her. In fact, he admitted he slept in the same bed with her, but never said he had intercourse with her, okay? Which is, do you really believe that? Okay, I'm not going to say yes or no, but think about that. But the thing is he admitted to taking a 14-year-old girl away from her family, bringing her to all across the country, and he wanted to work her as a hat girl during his act, okay? That, friends, is bizarre. And this was not the first time he had been brought to court about that, okay? So, was Chuck Berry a great musician? Yes. Was he a reprehensible human being? Yeah, he was that too. But here's the thing. The two need to be separated. And that's something that, for whatever reason, in this whole cancel culture that we have, we can't take a person, admire what they did, and give them credit for the good that they did. We can't do that anymore, and I don't know why. But we just don't, and we can't. I don't know why. Chuck Berry was a fantastic musician. He wasn't a great human being. But I will tell you this. If you take any individual who had some degree of greatness, something that set them apart from others, you can find stuff that makes them not a good human being. Everybody. Thomas Jefferson kept slaves as mistresses, okay? Martin Luther King, who was a reverend, had mistresses. Chuck Berry, well, we've already talked about all this kind of stuff. That doesn't take away from the greatness that these people had, okay? Everybody's flawed. Nobody's perfect. Everybody makes mistakes, some more than others, okay? You can't take one and discount it because of the other. You can't take the bad that they've done and cancel out the good. What you need to do, and I think we need to do this with Chuck Berry and all people of greatness, is say, okay, they did A, B, and C, which was good. They did X, Y, and Z, which was bad. That doesn't make them a bad person. That makes them a flawed human being who made mistakes, who, by the way, also did a lot of good. Well, that's it. We're done. JamesStrongShow@hotmail.com. That's the email address. Send me your email. I'd love to correspond with you, and I'd also really love for you to download the podcast, share it with your friends, get the distribution up to where it needs to be, or where it bigger than I'd like it to be. How's that? Okay. Numbers are still where they are, but we had a peak about probably close to a year ago, and we haven't gotten over that peak yet. So do me a favor, share it with others. Say, hey, listen to this Knotheads podcast. I think you'll like it. Download it, listen to it at your leisure. That's it. We're done. Until next time, this is James Strong saying adios.